it's really important to be aware of what factors in our life are out of our control.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we kind of put the mirror up to ourselves and our lives, I think most people would find that they are stressing and becoming preoccupied with those things that are out of their control.
Gabe, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for asking. I think I'm thankful. I'm grateful for a lot of things. And I have a lot of people to be grateful for as well. And a community around me that is a really good support system for me as well.
Mm.
So I would say I'm good and I'm grateful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been interesting. I mean, the last time we saw each other was a couple of days ago.
Mm-hmm.
We had a great party
Mm-hmm.
celebrating members of that community that
Yeah.
we both are part of. Are you recovered? How are you feeling?
From the party?
There was a lot of dancing.
It was a lot of dancing. Yeah. I think I took Sunday, the day after, pretty low key, pretty easy. But yeah, back at it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's I usually take a few. I don't take too much to recover, but this has been really like I needed more time than usual because, for those that are listening, if someone's listening from anywhere else in the world, Macedonian parties, the Balkan parties, they go big.
Yeah.
And it was really fun, but it was fun to see you there and obviously celebrate. And then it's even more fun to have you across me today. It's been a long time coming, and we usually start every episode by asking the most important question, and for us that is, what is mental health for you? So
to touch back on the
Yeah.
party real quick, I would say, to clarify, Macedonian parties are about 10% sitting and 90% dancing, just so that the American viewers have an idea.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, what is mental health? I think it's different for everybody. And I think that as life goes on, that answer changes for us. So currently, I think mental health is our ability to cope with our environment or ourselves. And we get to respond and we get to react to our environment. And I think what mental health is our ability to control that reaction. And there's a lot of different ways we can react to our environment or to things that happen to us. And we all know there's good ways and there's bad ways. And I've tried both of those. And I think that it's really important to not only be aware of our environment and what's going on in our lives, but really self-aware of how we're responding and how we're coping.
Yeah, because I think when it comes down to life, we can't control a lot of the things that it's happening to us. And I've found, for example, like just for me, that the only three things I feel like I can control is my reaction to what's happening, how much effort I'm going to put in, and what's the attitude towards that. How am I looking at it?
Absolutely.
Everything else, I mean, we decide to do this podcast, but electricity might go out, right? So, like, we can't control that. Like, but what's our reaction? Like, how are we going to respond to that? And I feel like once I've realized that for myself, it's been so much easier to go through life. Like, okay, I don't have control about 90-something% of the time. And all I can do is just, like you said, be aware of what's happening, and then what's my response?
Exactly. It's the controllable variables, the controllables versus the uncontrollables. And I think it's really important to define for ourselves what those factors are. And oftentimes, in my experience with mental health and stress and anxiety and the good and the bad, happiness and fulfillment and satisfaction, it's really important to be aware of what factors in our life are out of our control.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we kind of put the mirror up to ourselves and our lives, I think most people would find that they are stressing and becoming preoccupied with those things that are out of their control. So when we zoom in on the things that are in our control, we can get a sense of freedom in understanding that there's actually a very limited number of things that are in control, are in our control,
Mm-hmm.
like you said. So yeah, it's the controllables versus the uncontrollables.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, that freedom, because like as human beings, we want to know everything. We want to be in the know. We want to understand everything. But at some point, again, speaking from my own experience, I've realized that I don't want to, like, I might want to know everything, but that if I know everything, I'm not going to be able to do anything. I mean, just imagine if you knew that everything that's going on in the world. Like, there's a lot. You know, I knew I studied political science, but just how much involved with I was with that, I was like, I can't. I don't want to worry about Russia and Ukraine right now, because like I can't control that. I can, you know, I can worry about where I'm at right now, but if I worry about that and what's that going to lead into, then my mental health is deteriorating. I'm not sleeping well, because you think about, oh, World War III, we're all going to die. You have these thoughts. And then even on a smaller level, I can't control what you're going to do. I can't control if you're going to show up today at our green time or not. So it's like I'm just coming in ready for my piece, ready for my part of this, you know, relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And then if it happens, great. If it doesn't, then we'll move forward. But sometimes like we think that the more control we have, the more freedom we'll have. And I think it's the other way around.
Yeah. It's important to understand when it's time to surrender control, or to acknowledge that that thing is in fact out of our control. So I think there are certainly things that we should be aware of and stay informed on, but it's really important to acknowledge, like your example, you know, other people's actions are out of our control.
Yeah.
What is in our control is how we respond. So, you know, on a personal kind of social level, it's really important to have that awareness.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, where's that all coming from though? Because like, and I really like that you said at the beginning, like our view changes on mental health, like other things, and I would just add, like, if it doesn't change, we're not growing.
Yeah.
Like, I think growth comes with change, and change comes with growth. Both of those are going hand in hand. But for you, where did it happen? Like, what was there a point where like, okay, this is what I am right now, and what how I'm gonna live my life right now?
Yeah, I would say the past 2.5 years have been a time where I have looked outward at my environment and realized how little control I have. And what I've done voluntarily, but understood what I was forced to do, was look within and understand what's in my control and and how I can react and respond. So I would say that change came about 2.5 years ago, when I had a workplace accident. I was doing construction, working on a roof, and I came into contact with a high voltage power line, an overhead power line, and it shocked me unconscious, and then I fell off the roof 15 feet or 5 meters. And to kind of give you a shorter answer to that question, since that occurrence, there's been a process of looking at my surrounding and understanding how little control I have of that, and being forced to cope with my reality and my environment.
How does one survive that? Like, you know, you hearing that, like, not a lot of people would survive that.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, you were lucky enough in that. Thankfully, it happened. But like, how do you survive that? What's like?
Yeah, I think it's a miracle that I did. Like I said, I fell unconscious, so I could have fallen on my neck, or I had a paint pole, so the electricity hit my shoulder and passed through my hands. So there was a conductor for that electricity. Had that not been there, it might have been a different ending. But I would say, again, long story short, there was excellent medical staff that tended to me. I was helicoptered, evacuated out within, 20 minutes of it happening. And then had 2 helicopter rides to 2 different hospitals and had excellent care at the hospitals in Virginia, United States.
Yeah. And what was next? Like, I mean, obviously, like, how long did it take first? Like, what was the process of building, rebuilding almost yourself? Like, you say that was a key point of your life. What followed? Like, what made it a key point? Because, like, we were talking, like, if that's only that happened and there's nothing, like, what made it so impactful in your life?
I would say it was the lowest point of my life. So I remember a distinct moment in the hospital where I was being stretchered into the second hospital. At the first, they had concluded that they didn't have the equipment or the medical staff or whatever resources were necessary to take care of me. So they helicoptered me to a second facility. And it wasn't till I entered that facility. I knew things were bad. My hands were, from my elbow down, was burning from the inside is how I would describe it, because it was an electrical burn. And it wasn't till I was being stretchered in and there were like 30 or 40 medical personnel waiting for me. And then it felt like an episode of Grey's Anatomy.
Yeah.
And it was in that moment I realized, okay, I don't know what's wrong, but something's pretty wrong, or something's seriously wrong here. And it was a moment of chaos, of anxiety, of stress. I didn't know internally what had gone wrong. I didn't know if I had a fracture in my spine. I was in a splint. So it was a moment of complete, despite being surrounded by so many medical staff, it was a moment of complete isolation. And it's one that I won't forget, because as they're reaching over me and tending to the wounds and doing all different kinds of scans and tests, within what felt like 5 minutes, they were all gone. And I was stuck there and forced to cope with my surroundings. And I didn't know how to. I didn't know how to cope with being in that room. They didn't leave me. They were still nearby. It was in an emergency room. But I was forced to cope with that situation of not knowing what's happening. I don't know if I'm going to make it through this. I don't know if I'm going to have function of my hands, or if there's something wrong with my heart. And I would say that throughout that process, I was continually forced to cope with my environment, with myself, with my injuries, with my hands. So it was about 4 weeks in the hospital, over 10 surgeries. And thankfully, I would say one component that helped me significantly was, and something that ties well into mental health, is social support. And in my case, it was the support of my family. Thankfully, they were in the States. My parents live in Macedonia, but they were in the States at that time. So they were able to fly to the hospital the very next day. And my brother was in Virginia at the time, so he came right away to the hospital, and my sister flew from California. But I got to give them credit because their support gave me a foundation that I could start building up courage to cope, because I wasn't alone throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, and especially like when you said like, oh, there's so many people, but you feel alone because you're not sure what's happening, but then when you have those familiar faces around you, even though you still might not be sure what's happening, like you said, like they gave you the courage to maybe even accept where you're at and understand that, okay, I'm not in control anymore.
Yeah.
I can't do this on my own. But it was probably those familiar faces that helped you through that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And through those 4 weeks at the hospital, on a continual basis, there were, complications or moments that arose that were terrifying. And so I would say from the very first moment, I had the support to be able to cope, like I said, with courage. But I think consciously or subconsciously, I made a decision even then that I wasn't going to let this beat me, so to say. Let this have victory over me. The whole situation, my injuries and the mental health struggles and all of it combined. So,
yeah. Was that a decision that helped you after you left the hospital? Was that because, you were there for 4 weeks. Like, you leave there. Like, did that help you to, go into and be like, okay, now I'm focusing on this, and that? Or that actually was like, oh, this doesn't help.
Yeah.
I need something else.
Yeah, really good question. I'll preface by saying through those 2 years, there were a lot of wins and losses in my life. That was obviously the biggest loss of them all. But through the process, I kind of have a timeline of my recovery, my rehabilitation, and re-entering the world. But I would say there were a lot of wins and losses. So I think it was an unconscious decision to not let this beat me. But there were still so many losses after that. And there were wins too, and some wins that I'd like to share here too. But just coming out of the hospital, I felt like I was taking a loss every day. I began having, in the hospital, started having panic attacks with not an identifiable trigger, not some factor or situation or word that I could pinpoint and understand why this is happening and maybe trace back. So just to briefly describe what my panic attacks felt like, I think they have different symptoms for different people, but internally for me, what those felt like were obviously an increase in the heart rate and a feeling of adrenaline, a surge of adrenaline through the body, but simultaneously a compression of my lungs as if somebody is laying a 1,000-pound stone on my chest. So I can breathe, but I can't get a full breath. And I would compare it to In a car, you have the gas pedal and the brake pedal. And if you pressed both of those full throttle to the floor at the same time, it wouldn't be pretty. The body, the system, the mind is going 200 miles an hour, but at the same time it's being pulled back and restricted so heavily. So there were different kind of symptoms along with those, but shortly that's the answer, the way I would describe them. So coming out of the hospital, I started experiencing those kinds of attacks and started having nightmares too. I had a recurring nightmare where I was in a bird's eye view of the accident. And I would watch the whole thing play out. I would see the arc flash, the blue flame that erupted, and I would watch me fall off the roof, limp and unconscious. Only this time I would land on my neck and snap my neck and die. And in that moment, I'd wake up gasping for air, and I had to cope with that. And that would happen 3-4 times a night. So it was things like that became part of my everyday reality. And moments like that where I continually felt like I was taking losses. I couldn't win. I couldn't go through a day without experiencing some kind of fear. And the fear, I think I've been able to deconstruct what has happened enough. It's still a process that's going on. But I've been able to deconstruct it to a fear of going back to that hospital and being out of control again. I think a lot of people have that fear. Yeah. We don't like being out of control. We like preoccupying ourselves with things that are out of our control. And when we have to surrender control or even think about doing that, it's a scary thought. And a thought that I was forced into on a daily basis.
Yeah. How do you even begin to start the process of tracing back those fears? Because okay, you come back from the hospital and you start to experience that, the panic attacks, the nightmares, the fear of, well, I don't know, what if it happens again, or am I going to be normal again, or what are the first steps you took that helped you be where you are now? Not what helped you, but what are the first things that once you started realizing that, okay, I have a panic attack, I don't know what's happening, I can't sleep at night, what are the first steps you're doing to get you on the journey where you are right now?
Well, the first steps I remember taking were, as soon as I could, getting back in the gym. Fitness and exercise have been such a big part of my life for as long as I can remember. So in a sense, it was kind of all I knew how to do. And it was an activity, whether it was lifting or running, it was an activity that I knew could, one, empower me, and two, maybe even just take my mind off of it. So I would say exercise became somewhat of a mechanism of therapy for me. But even before that, it wasn't a conscious decision to try to start tracing kind of back to the origin of everything that was happening. I didn't have the capacity to try to deconstruct what was going on. I was just trying to swim. I was just trying to stay afloat. And in the midst of that, I'll come back to the support I had from my family and from my friends, and what I knew to do with my own body was to train,
Mm.
was to get in the gym, and to start trying to build up some kind of wins along the way. Because as most people have experienced with exercise, we tend to feel pretty good after we've exercised.
Yep.
And that's a good feeling, right? Endorphins are released. We've either got a good pump from the gym, or we've had a good run, we've had a good sweat. So all I knew was to chase that feeling. And I knew I had to slowly start putting myself in positions of discomfort and pain even, so that I could begin to build up strength to cope with the discomfort and pain I was experiencing on a daily basis.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you decided to run a 100-miler after
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. That was down the line.
Yeah.
That was almost 2 years,
Mm.
2 years after. And I would say, along with the training, along with the running, and I would say a hardening of the exterior, right? A hardening of the body, right? I was very weak. I got down to like 178 pounds, or roughly 84 kilos, I think. Whereas at the accident, when it happened, I think I was around 210 or 95, roughly. So I felt weak. I felt frail. I didn't feel comfortable walking down a hill. My legs just felt weak to the bone. So I knew I had to change that. I knew I had to strengthen my body and my mind, but really strengthen my body. In addition to that, I had to do, at that time, in kind of that first phase of dealing with this and coping with it, I had to do a softening of the interior. I had to talk about my feelings, which is something that is really, really hard to do, and is honestly a scary thing to even think about. To think about being vulnerable and showing emotion to another human being, it can be terrifying, because what it means is I'm going to face the problem. I'm going to face the fear. I'm going to speak it out loud. And amidst the coping I was doing with training and things like that, there were other habits that I had of coping that weren't as healthy. And I had to face those fears, that anxiety, with other people, and sharing them with friends and family, and opening up and talking to even a therapist.
Yeah.
Those were components of this process, of this rehabilitation, that were super important.
Yeah. You have a unique background and upbringing, you know. You've been you've been exposed to 2 different cultures from your early, from your birth, basically. So like Macedonians are very different than Americans. Like mental health, I think, is it's seen differently in both of our different cultures and environments. So like when you talk about talking to someone, and even going to a therapist or talking to your friends and family, like, was that like, yes, it is hard. For anyone, it's hard. But like, did you know that, okay, I can go and talk to them? It might be hard right now, but I know that this person, I can go and tell them, and they're not gonna, turn their back on me, or like, I know that I have people that will love for me to talk to them and tell them how I'm feeling and what I'm struggling with. or you were like that was still hard for you to see?
I think I had to overcome some maybe preconceived notions about therapy that I did grow up with. Growing up in Macedonia, I would say, pretty safely say that therapy, counseling are modes of treatment that are being developed still and continuing to be accepted slowly, but are slowly being accepted.
Yep.
In the States, we're a little bit more open with that. There is stigma for guys to talk about their mental health, but I think even with social media, it's depending on what content you consume.
Yeah.
It is becoming more and more of a supported and almost like uplifted thing for guys to do. Yeah. So I did have to, I would say in a sense, show courage to go and talk to somebody. And then also lower my ego a little bit. So it wasn't this therapy where you go and lie on somebody's couch and tell them about your feelings.
Yeah.
I was continually asking my therapist questions as he was asking me questions. And I was trying to learn from him, and he's trying to hear about what's going on with me. And we talked about exercise, and we talked about running, and I talked about the anxiety I was experiencing and the discomfort and then the struggle it was to exist, to go a full day, how difficult that was, and how unpleasant of an experience it was to be alive at that time. And to talk about the fear of what's to come. But the most interesting thing that I experienced in talking, in asking for help, was that I didn't feel like my injuries were valid enough. I didn't feel like I was injured enough to deserve this therapy. So to give an example of what I'm trying to say, we would constantly talk about how I felt like there were people that had it way worse, and I didn't need to not feel sorry for myself, but I didn't need to feel what I was feeling. And that was what I learned so backwards. Because I would compare my injury, 3rd-degree burns, numbness in my hands, constant anxiety, and I would compare it to somebody who's had a neck injury and is now quadriplegic. And I'd look at them and I'd say, I have so much to be thankful for. Why do I deserve an hour of your time? He was a trauma therapist. Why do I deserve an hour of your time? I feel like there's others that are going through far worse. And that is the reality. There are people that are always in a far worse situation and a far better situation. But the hard part of this was allowing me to feel what I was feeling. And letting my experience and my injuries be valid. And it wasn't this therapy of, oh, Gabe, you're fine. It's okay to feel sorry for yourself. It was proactive. I would tell him how I was feeling and share what was going on. And he would tell me straight up, that's not the case.
Yeah.
Or if we were talking about exercise, I was encouraged to exercise. So therapy for me, which I understand is not the case for everyone, was both a give and a take. I got to experience and gain insight, gain knowledge. I was constantly asking questions about anxiety and fear and how the mind works and learning. And then I was also having to face and confront a lot of those fears and talk about them. And I think that once we speak them out loud, we can often find that they're not as big of a problem as we had made them up to be in our head. So that was a little bit of my experience with that.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I think, I mean, you said, well, even as you were experiencing those things of like, okay, someone else has it worse. Yes, I'm thankful. Like, we're thankful that we're in the position that we're in, but that doesn't mean that we need to just be like, all right, the other part, I'll just feel sorry for myself that I need that help and someone else has it way worse than I. No, we are thankful where we at. I think it's good to hear, like, even from the beginning of our conversation, when I asked you, how are you doing? You're thankful. Like, we are thankful where we at. I think recognizing that, it helps us a lot, but then also being like, no, we all need help. You know, I know that everyone might not agree with this, but I do think everyone needs some sort of therapy, and whether that is like you were seeing a trauma specialist in therapy, like not everyone needs to go and do that, right? But there is avenues and there are ways and people that we can talk to for our current situation right now, whether that's going to be through actual like professional help, or it's going to be talking to someone that, I don't know, maybe a mentor if you're struggling with productiveness at work and that causes you anxiety and stress, or talking to, I don't know, friends and family if you're dealing with issues that they can attend to. But we all are in need, and I think conversation is, I mean, even this I think helps a lot. Like, I know that hosting this podcast for the last year, like, I've learned so much, and like it has helped me just to talk to people and hear their story and understand, okay, this is what Gabe is like, and that's what he was doing and what he went through, and what can I take from that, you know? And I think everyone, and I agree what you said, like once we speak it out loud, it becomes a reality. And I feel like that's probably why it helps, because until it's in our head, it's just in our head. But once we say it out loud, once we write it down, once we post that video or picture, it becomes a reality. And I think it can help us. I found that for me, once I say some of these things, I'm expecting and I know they have the effect of keeping me accountable too. Like, I could have never ran a marathon if I didn't tell anyone that I'm going to run it. But after, I don't know, like the last 10 kilometers, the last 5 miles of the race, the thought that everyone knew that today I'm running a marathon, it got me going. Mm-hmm. You know, I was like, there's no way I'm not going to finish it. And obviously this is different than anxiety, but it in some way, speaking it out loud can take different forms in different ways and can help us in the same those forms and ways.
Absolutely.
For me, it was that. For you, it was just like being able to hear yourself probably saying some of that and understand, like, whoa, yes, I mean, yes, there are people having it worse, but that doesn't mean that I'm not in a bad shape. So again, saying it, and I like that we're talking about this, because as men, we are thought differently. And for us in Macedonia, it's even worse, I would say, because we just don't talk about these things. Yeah. And yeah, I think it's really important to say those things out loud, say them on a platform like this that people can hear us talk about it. Yeah. And maybe take something or do something about that.
I think we all put up a front, and when we talk about it, when we open up, we kind of strip away that mask or that front, and we can really connect. Mm-hmm. That doesn't have to be therapy. That can just be an honest conversation with a sibling or a friend or a relative. But we all have the ability to relate on that deeper level. I think we all have difficulty getting to that level and getting to that point and stripping away that front or that mask to reach that level of connection. So whether it's just being open and honest with a friend, or seeking some more professional advice, I would say that in Macedonia, I have experienced somewhat of a stigma that opening up and talking about the reality of our situation, it can oftentimes be viewed as self-pity and complaining. And I think it's important to distinguish complaining about your situation and just being real about it and being honest about it. I would say complaining is blaming the world for your situation. And being honest and open with a friend or a family member can just be letting somebody in on how that potentially same situation is affecting you. Right? We're changing the focus point. Is the focus point on my surrounding? Am I complaining about the prices or my job or my coworkers? Or am I telling you as my friend, hey, this is hurting. This is where I'm at. This is what I'm feeling. And I think it's important to, as friends or family members, understand when we need to shut up. And understand when we just need to let our friends and family talk.
Yeah.
Again, we have to have a fine line between complaining and opening up. And maybe for some people that line's blurred, but it's important to, in an effort to be there for the people around us. It's important to not always have to try to solve their problems and sometimes just let them talk.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, something I've learned over the last year about this is that, and I'm trying to practice it with my close people, is, hey, I need to talk to you. I need to share this with you, but right now I don't need your advice. I don't need your solution. I just need you to listen. And sometimes it is, hey, I need an advice. Like, what do I do? Like, I need your help. So, like, even before you start that conversation, you set the expectation. You're like, hey, Gabe, I'm about to tell you something that it's on my mind and it's heavy on me, but I just want you to do this. Because sometimes I feel like we don't set those expectations with people, and then we're frustrated. They're telling us something that we already know. Like, I know how to get out of this, but right now I feel like I can't. And all I need right now is just a quality time with you for you to listen and maybe go for a run.
Yeah.
I don't need you to tell me, because I most likely know what I need to do.
Yeah.
But then other ways it's the other way around. Like, I actually need you to tell me, hey, Gabe, what do I need to do to get out of this?
Yeah.
So I think something like setting your expectations up front and being like, all right. And then another thing I just heard a few weeks ago was asking for permission to speak into someone's life. Like, hey, can I, and you're completely okay to say no. There is something I would like to share with you about what I've noticed about you, Gabe. Can I speak into that? And you have completely the right to say no. So I think I've mastered the first one. I got to figure out the second one. But I think that is something when we talk to people, I think we can have that on our mind that, yeah, we might think that they need this, but we need to ask them. And then reverse. We need to tell them what we need.
Yeah.
Because only that way I'm not going to be frustrated if you offer your your opinion. And
Yeah.
sometimes, you know, miscommunication happens, but if you have the expectations laid out, it's much easier to have that conversation and to accept what they're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's about boundaries, and it's important to set our own and then also be aware of others, other people's boundaries. And yeah, I think it's skills that are continually being developed.
Yeah.
So.
All right, let's talk about the 100-miler, because I do want to, like, I'm someone who's been running for the last few years as well, but, like, all right, you have lots of wins, lots of losses every single day. You feel like you can't really catch a break, you know, everything is hard, but how do you make that decision to run that?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how many people in the world have done that.
Yeah. So I'll say that, again, in that process, I was taking losses on a daily basis. And the gym helped. The gym helped me feel strong again. But it wasn't till I got back into running. I had been a recreational runner previously, done half marathons, a couple marathons. It wasn't till I got back into running that I was able to start getting some wins again. So I have one very significant story to me that I experienced on a training run where I was pretty consistently training on trails. So in mountain regions and trails far away from any kind of civilization or support of any kind. So on these trails, it wasn't uncommon for me to experience anxiety attacks and for my mind to start going down that rabbit trail of something bad is, this is what my mind would believe, something bad is going to happen and the outcome is horrible. So this particular instance, I was running and I got to the bottom of this hill. It was about less than half a mile hill, just kind of straight up. And I got to the bottom and I was met with an incredible amount of adrenaline and anxiety. And the thought that was consuming my mind was that when I get to the top of this hill, something will happen. Something will go wrong that will kill me, that will be the end of me. And I didn't know what it was. My mind is thinking, my heart's going to stop. The doctors missed some electrical or some kind of issue with my nervous system and how the electricity affected it. Something like that, stroke, whatever. But the belief in my head was that once I get to the top, I will die. And they will find me 3-4 days later. And I went through the whole thing. They'd stretcher me out and they'd have to reach out to my family and tell them what had happened. And that would be the end of me. That was the belief in my head. And that was my reality in that moment. And this was one of the most significant wins for me throughout this process. Because in that moment, all I wanted to do was get out of there. I wanted to turn back around, go to the car, go home. But I had to decide to face that. So I decided I'm going to climb this hill 10 times. And I got to the top of the hill. I looked around. Nothing happened. I'm okay. So I go back down the hill. Same anxiety attack. Same feelings. Same horrible feeling. Adrenaline, uneasiness. And I did it again. And I get to the top and nothing. I'm fine. So 10 times I went back to that same spot and met that same fear and anxiety and faced it, and then went back up the hill. So that moment was impactful for me because the way I chose to cope with my environment was to meet it head on, was to face it. And that was an important lesson I learned about anxiety. Anxiety is oftentimes a fear of something we can't control. And at that time, I couldn't control what happened to my body. I couldn't control whether I would have an anxiety attack or whether I would get injured again. I had a constant fear that something bad was going to happen. I think a lot of people can have similar feelings of uneasiness, of fear, of worry for things out of their control. And one of the biggest things I learned about anxiety was that the best way to cope with that is to face it, to look it in the eye, and to say, do your worst. Show me what you got. Not to run from it, not to take something to numb it, not to put the TV on and get your mind off of it, but to sit with it and to face it. And that was the beginning of about a year and a half long process where I continually had to face that fear on the trails. And at the end of those training runs, it wasn't always pretty. I wouldn't just finish and be, all victorious. I would be just as scared, just as anxious, just as worried for if something's going to go wrong. But the accumulation of those wins was what started to build up confidence and started to make me feel like a normal person again. So fast forward through that year and a half, running became my method of coping. And it was a method of coping because it forced me to be with my thoughts. It forced me to be alone with what was going on in my head. And I wanted nothing more than to be out of my head and to just be talking or listening or watching something. Anything but to be alone with my thoughts, basically. And running forced me for hours on end to sit with those thoughts. And on top of talking them out and letting them out with friends and family, this was a time where I had to sit with it. I didn't do music or anything like that. So I started doing ultra marathons. So an ultra marathon is a distance longer than usually 50K. And they're usually on trails in mountains. So it was a double bonus because it wasn't like I was running on the road where if something happens, if I collapse, someone will call 911. That thought of being alone in the mountains was frightening. So the ultra marathons gave me confidence to continue coping and cope better with what was going on. So there was that year and a half, I think I did about 9 ultra marathons, 50Ks, 80Ks, and then the last one was a 168 kilometer ultra marathon, 105 mile race. So I was looking at this race. This was 2024. In January of this year, I was looking at this race, and I couldn't do it. I didn't want to. I wanted to, but I didn't want to. I was scared of the idea. And so I just left it. I didn't sign up. And then 3 weeks before the race, I'm on the phone with one of my buddies, and he gave me the push I needed to. Deep down, I knew I had to do it. I knew it in January. I knew it in February. I knew it 3 weeks before. But I needed that push to sign up and do it. So we made a deal. We made a bet that I would run this race and he would do a fitness challenge, lose weight. And like you did with your marathon, I told everybody I could. I needed the pressure to run this race. I needed the incentive, the accountability. And I didn't know yet what that race would mean for me, but I would find out shortly.
What was the feeling once you figured out that you can do it?
Well,
or when was it, you know?
That I can do it?
Yeah.
Not until I finished. So that's another part of it too, because as you're running, you're faced with doubt the whole time. The race took me 31 hours. So there is no comfort in, oh, it's just around the corner and then we're done. I think I'll just do like the timeline of the race, if that's okay. Yeah. So we start at 6 a.m. I had a crew of 4 individuals, which again, kind of going back to that social support, so important. And especially in fitness and exercise. Having somebody that's on your team, that's at your back, and wants you to push forward, wants you to succeed. It can be going out by the river for a 1 kilometer walk. But if you've got somebody that knows you're doing it and is rooting for you, it can mean the world. Yeah. And in this race, them being there meant the world to me. It was my brother, his girlfriend, my cousin, and another friend. And that was my team. So I started the first third of the race. I'll give you the condensed version of the race. The first third, or the first 50, 55K, it was just pouring. The trail was flooded with water up to my knees. And I could have been really frustrated with it, but I just chose to say, all right, good. Let's do this, It was out of my control. And pretty optimistic. Just feeling fresh. From the get-go, from the beginning, I made sure my nutrition and hydration was on point, and kind of the plan was locked in. Frequent eating, twice an hour, with electrolytes and everything. So the first 50K, I'm feeling good. But going into the race, I knew the race wouldn't start till 80 kilometers, till the halfway point. Because 80 kilometers was the most I had run until that point. So that's what was familiar. It was after that was the unknown. So once I had some of my pacers come into the race with me, once we got to the 50 mile or the 80K mark, that's when the race started, and that's when my spirits died. It was getting to the middle of the night, and my feet were wet. My shoes were sloshing around, and I was running. It was kind of like an out and back. The first 50K was its own little circle, and I was still running away from the finish line. So we had to run 30 miles one way and then 30 miles back to the finish. And I was still running away from the finish line, which in a race is pretty discouraging, especially a race of that length.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was in new territory and running away from the finish. So mentally, spirits were low. But I had pacers with me, and I had my team with me. And the strategy for this race, which is a strategy I think can be good for tasks in life too, was to not think about the race as a 100-mile race, but think about just getting to the next aid station. To break up this race into smaller, almost bite-sized sections, and to get to each aid station and then worry about the next one. So again, the goal was just to continue to each aid station. And the promise I made at the beginning of the race was, I'll go as long as I can go. If something happens where I can't move anymore, I'll stop. I'm not. Unlike the time where I climbed the hill 10 times, this time I wasn't going to give my life for this race. Then I was prepared to risk it all. I had to, right? But for this race, I decided I'll go as long as I can. And if I can put another foot in front of the other, I'll do that. And each time as I'm running away from the finish line and getting further and further, what felt like further and further, and climbing these hills in the darkness and hallucinating and seeing things that aren't there, every time I questioned whether I can do this or wanted to stop, I remembered the promise and that I can take another step. I can get to the next aid station. After that, I don't know. I don't know if I can make it, but I know I can make this next section. And breaking things up into smaller tasks, smaller responsibilities, it makes the big task and the big race feel a little bit more manageable.
Yeah, and it makes you feel like you can actually get there.
Yeah, exactly.
I had the same, I didn't run 100 miles, or 105, but like my marathon, like first 20Ks, like, all right, I know this, like you said, like I've ran a half marathon before. It wasn't easy, but like, yeah, I did it. And then I was like, okay, I gotta get to the next aid station. Like, that's it. I'm going to run, walk, whatever the method is, I'm going to get to the next aid station, see where I'm at, and then keep going. And then on to that. And it really is like that, where it gives you like those chunks, I can, a small win.
Exactly.
I'm not going to feel like, it's so big. No, I got to get small wins along the road in order to get the big one at the end. Exactly. And yeah, no, it, like you said, this is applicable in anything. Like, even in sports, like, when the playoffs are on, like, you can't think about the final game. You might make the finals, but if you think about the finals, you might lose against the next opponent that they had no chance in beating you otherwise. But when you look too far ahead, kind of lose the track of what's in front of you, and especially in that kind of challenge, you're like, well, yeah, the next aid station is. Were you in a better place there, because you said you were not ready to risk your life for it, versus like the hill?
Yeah.
Like, were you in a better place mentally, anxiety, panic attacks? Like,
yeah, I would say as time went on, I continued to get better. And back to what we talked about, it was a hardening of the mind and of the body. Simultaneously, a softening and an allowing for myself to experience, to feel what I was going through. So it was internal and external work that was going on at the same time. And the races combined with the, letting it out and talking to people, continued to get me to a better and better place. And with this race, like I said, there were wins and there were losses throughout this process. And finishing this race was the question whether I could finish this race was a doubt in my mind till a mile before the finish. One, we were cutting close to the cutoff time, which was 32 hours, and I finished in 31 and 21 minutes. So with roughly 40 minutes to spare in a 100-mile race, that's cutting it a little close. Yeah. But while I wasn't experiencing that same anxiety during that run, there was still fear whether I can finish this, and fear whether something's going to go wrong. So I would say I had built up a significant amount of confidence with the training that I had been doing, the hardening of the exterior and the softening of the interior. And what this race symbolized was, as I finished and as I reflected on it afterwards, it was an accumulation of the work I had done. And what it meant to me was that if I can do this race, if I can run for 31 hours and run 100 miles and be with myself for that long, then I can go through and I can beat what's going on internally and what's going on in my everyday life. And it symbolized the completion of that recovery, because until then I still wasn't sure if I'm gonna fully recover. But that race symbolized that I know I will, because I can do this. Yeah. So in our lives, we have wins, we have losses, and the losses bring us down. And in my opinion, our response to those losses can compound on them or can reverse it and can bring us back up with whatever kind of win, whether it's exercise or work or whatever it is, personal development. We need those wins, and we need moments of victory that give us confidence and courage to cope.
Yeah. My last question for you, because we're running a little bit short of time, but where is Gabe right now? Obviously you've made the decision to move back to Macedonia. Briefly tell me a little bit about that, but where are you right now in this journey that we've talked about for the last hour and so?
Yeah. I would say I'm still reflecting. The thing I'm most thankful for in this experience has been the capacity it's given me for empathy and for understanding. Because before I had never experienced something so traumatic. And having lived a very miserable everyday life for so long, I have a little bit more understanding for what people might be going through and the struggles they might have. And I do believe that everybody you see is experiencing something to a certain degree. And just having a little bit of empathy can help that understanding. So right now I'm in Skopje. I'm training clients. I do personal training. I help people get out of the hole that they might be in. So whether it's obviously physical health, but I help people get those victories. And those victories for me came in the fashion of internal growth and external. And that's what I help people do through exercise, through nutrition coaching. So I do in-person and online based out of Skopje here in Macedonia. If they want to reach me, they can reach me at JacksonFitness_24 on Instagram. And we have a website, jacksonfitness.net, where they can reach us.
Yeah. The last thing we're going to do is, just like in any episode of the Kako Si podcast, is what's your questions for those that are listening to us right now?
How are you coping? And be real with yourself. Are there things that you know you should be doing that you're not doing? I think there are.